It's about 1:30, so welcome everyone. This is the public information meeting VDOT's holding on the regulatory changes associated with Chapter 870, was passed by the General Assembly at the last session. My name is Robert Hoffrichter. I am the Assistant Division Administrator for the Transportation Mobility Planning Division. What we're going to do is we're going to have a short presentation on the overall concepts that are covered in the legislation and how we got there and the regulations. Then the presentation will be followed by a question and comment period so that people here and online can submit their comments or questions, which will be answered here. In addition, if you're online, you have issues, comments, and questions, please send those to landdevelopmentregs@vdot.virginia.gov. Once again, as I mentioned, following the presentation, this meeting will function as a public input session, with each person given a few minutes to speak. Selected email questions will also be answered during the meeting, but comments submitted over the internet will not be discussed, but they will become part of the public record, as will everything else that happens here, and will be reviewed. This broadcast is being recorded, and it will be posted on our site sometime next week. In 2011, the General Assembly passed Senate Bill 1462, which after the governor's signature became Chapter 870. This legislation directed the Commonwealth Transportation Board and the Virginia Department of Transportation to receive and consider public comments and make changes to 3 land development regulations: the secondary street acceptance requirements, the traffic impact analysis regulations, and the access management regulations. But with respect to the latter, only as they handle family subdivisions of land. The Commissioner is required to approve the access management and traffic impact analysis revisions, and the Commonwealth Transportation Board must approve the changes to the secondary street acceptance requirements. All of the regulations must be approved by November 30th in order to retain their exemption from the Administrative Process Act. And revisions will become effective January 1st of 2012. For public input, VDOT set up their website and began soliciting comments back in spring. We also submitted and posted an announcement on the Virginia Regulatory Town Hall. We also contacted over 300 individuals who had previously submitted comments on the regulations. The comment period was April through May. We collected 80 letters and emails. We also created 2 committees to go through potential regulatory changes. There was an internal technical committee made up of people from various divisions in the central office and our districts. And the districts would be one that would implement most of this, so that their input was very critical. In addition, we formed an external policy advisory committee. The policy advisory committee was to review comments, propose changes, and provide feedback on other changes. In addition, the advisory committee was composed of representatives from local government, engineering companies, land development or groups, and growth management organizations. The group was headed by VDOT's Deputy Commissioner, Charlie Kilpatrick. On the screen are the regulations that are impacted, including their legal sites, and the code sections that control them. The traffic impact analysis. The current requirements are that localities submit comprehensive plan and or rezoning proposals to VDOT for review if those would have an effect on the operation of state highways. VDOT then provides advisory comments back to the locality, which the locality may use or discard at their pleasure. The primary comments that we received regarding this regulation were several, dealing with traffic volumes. That one was that the traffic volume thresholds are set too low. In other words, they were getting too many submissions, that they were going too low in terms of what constituted significant impact to state highways. Another one was that locality data requirements should not be duplicated by VDOT standards. So if the locality had standards for studies, and VDOT found that those studies look like they work, we should be using the local standards. There was a request to give credit to trips authorized by current zoning rather than just on the ground. That only trips in excess of the current use should be considered in TIAs for retaining the current regulations and to allow alternative trip generation rates determined by the localities. Our proposed amendments are listed on the board. Requirements for site plan subdivision plats and plans of development have been deleted. That's a requirement of Chapter 647, passed by General Assembly this year. Rezoning applicants can submit a locality-approved TIA that is consistent with VDOT's requirements. And that will have a certification process where a locality's process can be certified. And if they have that certification, we automatically go with their requirements. We increased the trip thresholds for rezonings from 2,500 or 250 per peak hour to 5,000 per day for all sources of generation. Previously, it had been split depending on whether you were residential or non-residential. In addition, the low volume trip threshold, which is in the current regulation, was increased from 200 trips per day to 400 trips per day. Rezoning submittals would not be required if there is no change in the land use or there's a lower trip generation compared to current zoning. Rezoning submittals can be of a lower scope if consistent with prior comprehensive plan submitted, and that is a requirement of Chapter 888, which is again passed at this last year's Assembly session. We established a deadline to schedule TIA scoping meetings, and was set at 60 days. And we amended the requirements for the traffic impact analysis methodology to be consistent with current practice. On secondary street acceptance requirements, they established the standards for streets to be accepted into the state secondary system for maintenance. The legislative goals of that were to ensure the connectivity of road and pedestrian networks, to minimize stormwater runoff, and to address performance bonding needs for new streets. Under Chapter 870, the CTB will address any changes to the SSAR at its October 19th meeting, and the effective date will again be January 1st, 2012. Current requirements include a connectivity index, which are standards to enhance the street connectivity. The area types, which divides the state into 3 regions, and that impact what level of connectivity is required for different development. It also allows addition of streets as network additions, in other words, as groups of streets instead of individuals. It has a requirement for pedestrian accommodations in certain circumstances, and connectivity index context-sensitive street design is encouraged, along with allowing third-party inspections to allow processes to move forward if VDOT inspectors are not available. The primary comments that we received had to do with connectivity. Connectivity index was confusing and did not increase transportation efficiency, that there should be a better way to enhance connectivity. The pedestrian accommodation, the lot size requirements were too large for the level of accommodation required. There was a request to eliminate area types and disagree with how the area types were defined. There was another one to retain current SSAR regulation as is. Another one to provide a more meaningful penalty for localities that do not require connections to existing stub-outs. Our proposals with regard to this regulation are to eliminate the connectivity index and to eliminate area types. Since area types primarily impact the connectivity index, felt that those two went together. Reduce median lot sizes for pedestrian accommodation and to add a traffic volume threshold for those, which was not present in the original regulation. To penalize localities that prevent stub-out connections through impacts to the revenue sharing program rather than to their secondary construction allocations. To require additional external connections when network addition contains over 200 dwelling units or the use generates over 2,000 vehicles per day. This would be the replacement for the connectivity index in the previous version. The last 2 changes primarily deal with speed of process. In other words, to make the decision point in VDOT lower down in the organization so that waivers and exceptions can be handled quicker. For access management, it was established back in 2007. The goals were to reduce traffic congestion, enhance public safety, by reducing conflict points, reduce the need for additional highways by preserving the infrastructure that we currently have, and to ensure private property is entitled to reasonable highway access to support economic development. In Chapter 870, the revisions to that regulation are limited to those that impact family subdivision entrances. The Commissioner has to consider these and adopt revisions by November 11th. The effective date is again January 1st, 2012. Current access requirements separate entrances into two types. Private entrances, which serve up to 2 homes with minimal design standards and no site distance requirement, and commercial entrances that serve more than 2 homes that consist of paved entrances, intersection site distance requirements, and spacing standards. The proposal is to change the definition of commercial entrance to refer to more than 50 vehicle trips per day. So in other words, an entrance that carries more traffic, equivalent to over 5 dwelling units. To add a low-volume commercial entrance definition, which allows entrances serving more than 2 homes and up to 5 homes. And then a low-volume commercial entrance standard that would then allow it to meet private entrance standards, but it has still a stopping site distance requirement to preserve safety. Now at this point, winding down on the formal presentation, for those of you that are online would like to submit comments or questions, once again, land development regs at VDOT.virginia.gov. Next, I will ask members of the Policy Advisory Committee that are here to come up and give their comments. Once again, speakers will be given about 3 minutes, and then after that, if anyone else in the audience here has any comments they'd like to make, we'll ask them, and I'll alternate that with questions off the internet. Again, video is being recorded, and the results will be posted. Stuart, would you like to come up and make some comments? Oh, I'm sorry, Tripp. Go ahead. Go ahead and identify yourself.
I'm Tripp Pollard with the Southern Environmental Law Center, where I'm the director of our main community program. This overview's done an excellent job of identifying a lot of the key issues, a lot of the key changes proposed in these regulations. Chapter 870 did direct a review to look at needed improvements to these sets of regulations. And it looks at some provisions that are incredibly important steps that Virginia took in recent years with strong bipartisan support to better link transportation and land use, which is good for taxpayers, good for the environment, and good for our communities. VDOT's to be commended for their efforts at public outreach. There's been a lot of effort to reach out to folks and review these provisions, and I was glad to serve on the advisory committee. Also, I wanted to recognize clearly an enormous amount of staff time went into looking at alternatives and options to improve these provisions. Nonetheless, there are some elements of this review that have been very rushed, and it shows. The Policy Committee spent a lot of time discussing the proposed changes to 2 of the 3 areas that Rob mentioned in the introduction. We spent a fair amount of time on traffic impact analysis and the changes to access management. And most of these changes strike a reasonable balance among various interests, although we still have some significant concerns I'll point out in a moment. In contrast, very little time was spent on secondary street standards, despite the importance of these provisions. As a result, we believe that these provisions need further discussion, development, and improvement. The current draft simply goes too far, and we do not support such sweeping changes at this time. I'd like to say a little bit more about some of the key points with traffic impact analysis first. Given the limited time here, I'll just provide a few points and then additional details after the meeting. On traffic impact analysis, we believe the traffic volume threshold would be raised too much under the proposal. We would be willing to compromise and could support raising the standard to 5,000 trips per day in areas with higher population density, but not across the board. This proposal is too much for smaller communities and rural areas. Second, the latest draft added some language to support consistency of requirements from localities being approved as adequate traffic impact analysis. There's broad support of this idea of greater use of local requirements because this will, we believe, reduce unnecessary duplication if implemented properly. We do think certification addition, the language is helpful, but may be strengthened further. Finally, with traffic impact analysis, we believe the criteria was reduced too much for rezoning applications that are consistent with a local comprehensive plan. We believe that in those instances, you should go to the next lowest applicable level of review, not have all reviews falling in this category automatically go to the lowest level of review possible. Bottom line is we believe with some rather modest adjustments that this will be improvement in the existing regulations, but we've got to make sure that new development that harms the performance of the transportation network is identified before being approved and moving forward to construction. With secondary streets, as I mentioned, there's broad support initially for this legislation and regulation based on the recognition that we can't simply continue to accept new streets in the secondary system unless they're better designed to support the functionality of the transportation system as a whole. Improving interconnectivity between adjacent land uses provides numerous transportation, fiscal, environmental, and safety benefits, and the SSAR provisions were a big step forward and have received national recognition. Unfortunately, the proposals developed would undo many of these benefits. In many ways, they would effectively return us to the status quo, which would be costly to taxpayers, transportation system as a whole, and create unsafe environments for pedestrians. I'd like to just touch on a couple of points here. First, elimination of area types and related provisions elsewhere in the regulations. We favor some revision of the current definitions, especially to provide some relief for rural areas. However, eliminating all area types we believe goes too far and doesn't recognize the differences between different parts of the country. Second, the changes to connectivity requirements we believe go too far as well. We favor keeping the existing connectivity index, but are willing to consider a move to a per unit standard. However, this is a major move, and we think it needs further work, adjustment, discussion, and negotiation before it moves forward. If it moves forward, at the very least, some of the language needs to be strengthened. For example, there's a call for multiple connections in multiple directions on page 22 of the draft regulations, but there's nothing to actually require connections in multiple directions. We're also concerned that this approach is likely to result in the loss of any internal connectivity. If we're going to move to this new approach, among the other changes we're concerned about is the double credit provided for connectors. We believe that at most there should be a limited extra bonus for these types of roads, since it's limited to those already in the comp plan and localities will be promoting these anyway. In addition, if we go with this per unit approach, we believe there needs to be a higher number of connections required, typically raised to 3 rather than 2, and that there be some additional bonus provisions included to help make up for that. For example, if there's credit for connectors, it should be rather than double, maybe at most 1.5, but also add extra credit for other types of connection. Finally, on this, let me point out that I think the proposed changes to pedestrian accommodation requirements weaken these important provisions too much. Among other things, the ADT thresholds are too high. For example, we think it should go back to including more of a look at lot size, rather than just overly weakening these requirements. So those are the changes we think are needed. Some of the substantive changes. Finally, on this one is the penalty provision. We're concerned it's too weak. We think you should either go back to the current standard or at least make localities ineligible for a longer period of time for revenue sharing or for infrastructure funding. A better penalty would be for the state not to accept new development streets in the secondary system in such a case. We recognize these are very controversial, again, an issue where we think further discussion would help us come up with better standards. The proposed changes, we believe, bottom line, are more excessive than required, and especially in light of the fiscal situation facing the Commonwealth, facing our localities, we need to not take such a major step in the wrong direction. Thank you.
Thank you, Trey. Mike Olson, check.
Well, good afternoon. I'm Mike Tolson. I'm the Chief Executive Officer of the Home Builders Association of Virginia. For those of you who don't know, HBAV is a 4,000-member organization of home builders and companies that provide products and services to the housing industry throughout the Commonwealth. Today I'm also speaking on behalf of the Virginia Association of Commercial Real Estate, who couldn't be with us today. I'm pleased to say that HBAV is here to support the proposed changes to the VDOT access management regulations. Both organizations believe the proposed amendments create a better balance between property rights, the need for public safety, and the need for congestion relief better than the current access management regulations. I will not go into great detail today because we have met in lengthy sessions on 2 occasions, and as a member of the advisory committee, I understand we're going to meet another time on October 6th. I'd like to continue by saying HBAV and Vaker also support the proposed changes to the VDOT traffic impact analysis regulations. Both organizations believe the proposed changes will allow VDOT to focus more of their limited resources on those projects that will significantly impact the state system. We also believe the proposed changes will allow smaller projects to proceed with greater speed and at less cost, while preserving localities' discretion to require TIAs if they determine such submissions are necessary. Finally, and I think most importantly for the struggling housing industry, but also the commercial industry, HBAV and Vaker support, with a few clarifying amendments I've provided, proposed changes to the VDOT connectivity regulations. Let me make it clear that the members of HB support connectivity between new and current, and future subdivisions. We want connectivity, but we want it to be meaningful, and we want it to be accomplished in a way that will not only connect existing subdivisions with new subdivisions, but will also protect those adjacent or nearby major and minor arterials from unnecessary access. HBAV and Vaker believe the goal of the connectivity regulations should not be to create more developments with a grid street patterns, which creates more stormwater that has to be managed, or to discourage cul-de-sacs, but to connect separate developments over time that do not become totally dependent upon nearby state-maintained thoroughfares for local traffic. I'd also like to make it clear that HBAV believes these regulations are in fact consistent with Senate Bill 1181 in 2007 that brought about these initial regulations. And as stated in the bill, that bill was designed to ensure connectivity of road and pedestrian networks with existing and future transportation network additions. There was not one word of mention of connectivity within developments and the hazards that come with that. I'd like to thank you for the opportunity to comment today, and I'd like to say I look forward to the continuing discussions with Mr. Pollard, Mr. Stewart, and the staff at VDOT. I am convinced that at our October 6th meeting, we can continue to work together and likely reach consensus on all these outstanding issues. Thank you, and I'll be happy to add my comments to any questions should they come in.
Thank you, Mike. Stewart, would you like to come up?
Hi, I'm Stuart Schwartz. I'm the Executive Director of the Coalition for Smarter Growth. We've worked with groups across the state and certainly partnered with the Southern Environmental Law Center in Trip Pollard for a long time. I have been happy to serve on this committee, and I really appreciate the professional performance of VDOT in this and working through a really complex set of issues. Enjoyed the thrill and the give and take. It was not quite like the Middle East peace talks with the development community at these meetings, but and we've got some points of agreement that Trip has highlighted, but we do not have consensus on everything. We'll see what happens on October 6th, where I'll celebrate my birthday with the committee. I want to remind folks that, these 2 regulations, in particular 3 regulations, access management, traffic impact regs, and secondary street connectivity, were all intended to help out VDOT. They're all intended to reduce the burden on VDOT for trying to address all of our traffic problems with just a few major arterial roads. That it was a bipartisan effort in 2007, and that we heard from, particularly from Republican legislators, that they were tired of an unfunded mandate, basically a bill being handed to the General Assembly and the VDOT for public roads as a result of the patterns of land use that we've been building. It was also, at the same time, it was a conservative initiative. It was also a progressive initiative. How about that? And the bottom line is it's about saving the resources of VDOT. It's about ensuring that if we take streets into the state system, that they are truly serving a public purpose. If they have limited in and out and can't be used by the general public effectively, then they're not truly public streets. The connectivity also helps all of us by reducing traffic on major arterials. There is plenty of evidence that having a connected network of local streets make a huge difference. It can also help to decrease the state's maintenance, operations, and capital deficit for transportation. Really, ultimately, it is about saving money. On the traffic impact regs, I think I'll just highlight the two main points. Number one, we think the threshold at 5,000 would be too high. We think 2,500 vehicle trips per day is a good threshold. There is more administrative and the planner headaches for VDOT, but hopefully the goal is we'll have more facts and information for the engineers on the other side of it. In terms of the rezonings, we also are concerned that they're getting too much of a break on those, and that there's a big difference between a comprehensive plan traffic analysis and a particular rezoning traffic analysis in a particular location. On secondary street connectivity, we don't find that the connectivity index is that hard to use, but if we can get something that achieves at least comparable connectivity, we'll be okay with that. But we don't think we can separate out and remove the particular areas from rural, suburban, and urban. There are differences between those, and in particular, if anything, these regulations are intended to tackle the suburban problem we've had, where we've forgotten how to build connected streets and we're not connecting these well enough. If we go with the new proposal, we don't think collector roads should get double credit. We already built collector roads with lots of cul-de-sacs, and I don't think they've helped our problem very well. I think we do need to insist on not just the in and out of one collector road, but at least one or more additional connections beside that. I think it's something we'll have to work out on October 6th. For those concerned about your children and yourselves walking in your neighborhood or walking to and from school, we're concerned that we're reducing the point at which sidewalks are required on both sides of the street, and that I think it's only about a half mile that we're requiring the sidewalk to schools, no matter how large the neighborhood might be. The local districts like kids to walk to school within a mile of school if we can provide them safe routes. And there's a huge movement for safe routes to school, both bike and pedestrian, in our country right now. I will leave it at that, but I would just remind you that we are trying to work towards a common goal of improving the performance of our transportation system, reducing the cost to the taxpayers of transportation, and then having good analysis of traffic impact, including at the 2,500 vehicle per day threshold, and having strong connectivity requirements and good bicycle and pedestrian accommodation will benefit all of us. Thank you.
Thank you, Stuart. Doug, would you like to say something? Identify yourself.
Pardon me? Yeah. I'm Doug Fall. I'm with Dewberry and Davis. I wasn't asked to represent any particular group in a role on the advisory committee. However, Phil Abraham, who could not be here today, as Mike Folson's already indicated, did ask if I would simply reiterate his support of the proposed revisions, particularly to the traffic impact requirements, traffic impact study requirements that are in the draft form and are before you all today. And the most significant of which, of course, is the raising of the threshold or trigger to 5,000 vehicle trips per day. The legislation that resulted in the traffic impact study regulations that are required by VDOT was primarily to coordinate transportation and land use. And that was a lot was being discussed about that during the legislative session in which they were adopted. The truth is, the best time to do that is when you're developing the comprehensive plan, not at the time of rezoning. VDOT and the Highway Department need to work and collaborate closely during the formulation of both the land use and the transportation plan. In a nutshell, the locality figures out what it wants to do to accommodate growth. It adopts a land use plan for the future. And then what really needs to happen, if we're going to truly coordinate land use and transportation, is then a transportation plan needs to be designed, both transit where appropriate, as well as major thoroughfares such as arterials, minor arterials, and even some collectors. That then needs to be developed collaboratively between VDOT and the locality, such that the transportation plan adequately serves the land use plan that's adopted. What that means is providing connectivity between communities and neighborhoods. It means reducing travel times, minimizing delays and congestion, and that's only going to happen if we develop a transportation plan that's adequate. It is not accomplished by a series of disjointed, fragmented, individual traffic studies that are conducted at the time of rezoning. Now, that having been said, raising the trigger to 5,000 trips per day, which, by the way, VDOT had said in the regulations that are on the books today, was basically their definition of what was a substantial impact on a comp plan. So if somebody was going to make a comp plan amendment or adopt a new comp plan or presumably change the transportation component of the comp plan that was going to have an effect of 5,000 vehicle trips per day, they just said that was what substantial impact or effect was. So we've taken that number that was already in the VDOT reg and simply made it the threshold or trigger for rezonings. And frankly, I think at the end of the day, that's not an unreasonable compromise. And for those that would argue that it should be lower, I mean, I would just as quickly, having been in the business for 45 years, would argue that, frankly, we should be doing traffic studies for really large traffic generators, regional malls, stadiums, that sort of thing, and not 140,000 square foot office buildings or 120,000 square foot retail shopping centers or 500 lot residential buildings. That's effectively the numbers you get when you use the 5,000 trips per day as the threshold or trigger. Mike Tolson basically expressed my comments on connectivity. There were two goals in that legislation. One was to improve connectivity, and that was primarily between existing development and future developments, and it was to recognize that we've had a political problem for years, and I've experienced this in my career and in doing subdivision designs throughout Fairfax, Prince William, and Loudoun over the last 40 or more years. And that is that a developer would provide a stub street, and then the adjoining property would come in 5 or 10 years later. The developer would go to connect to that stub street, and everybody in the existing development would raise, you know what. And the politicians would sit there faced with the prospect of rezoning this land and going against their constituents. And so what would happen is they would say, don't make the connection. So like along Keymill Road, Braddock Road, roads like that in Fairfax, we've got a lot of places where we can see individual subdivisions with no interaction, pedestrian or vehicular, between each other. Every local trip has to go out on the main road, the thoroughfare, adjoining thoroughfare, to get anywhere. This legislation, the regs that were promulgated were designed to overcome that. That was to provide the connectivity between existing and future development. Collector roads, despite what was said a moment ago, it really is the best way to assure that connectivity. There are great examples in Loudoun County adjacent to Route 28, Route 7, and Route 50, where the county did some long-range planning for collector roads, and it's keeping local traffic off of Route 50, Route 7, and Route 28. The last goal of that legislation was to not increase imperviousness, but to decrease it. Ironically, the mathematical formulaic approach that was used with the connectivity index, where you divide street segments and you have a ratio between street segments and intersections. What it did was it discouraged cul-de-sacs. I mean, in fact, it really, and we know that because we tried to use this connectivity index, and not only on future developments that we were involved in, but we went back and tested it on existing developments. We found that there were places where there was good connectivity, but it failed to meet the connectivity index because there were too many cul-de-sacs in that development, according to the connectivity index. There were other developments where basically we didn't meet the connectivity index, and yet there was good connectivity. So the truth of the matter is the mathematical approach is not the right thing to do. When you're designing subdivisions, streets, and development streets, I hate to use the word art as an engineer, but it's as much art almost as it is science. And you can't use the same kind of approach with a formula that we do for water in a pipe, storm drainage, and the like, which is science. And it does lend itself to the rules of physics and science. And frankly, that isn't the case with subdivision street design. So I think we've got a good compromise, and I believe that we should be adopting the regulations as presented. And I know I took longer than the 3 minutes, but I got a lot off my chest. Thanks. Appreciate it very much.
Thank you, Jack. Before I start calling anyone in here, if anyone else has any comments or questions, we've been getting a lot of questions off the internet, and I'll start off with this one right here. The question is, why are entrances serving more than 2 homes called commercial entrances? Are there multiple types of commercial entrances now? The reason that entrances serving more than 2 homes are called commercial entrances is because state code divides entrances into 2 categories. They're either private or they're commercial. So the decision was made many years ago that 2 homes constituted private, and more than that was a commercial use of some kind. Now, whether that falls in the normal definition of commercial or not, that's up to you to decide, but that's the way we've defined it in the regulations. It makes sense, and it seems to work. Does anyone here like to have a question or like to make a comment? All right. Seeing no hands, I'm moving on to the slew of questions dealing with traffic impact regulations. I'm going to take my glasses off because I'm getting old and I just can't see with glasses on. All right, first question. Connectivity index. Did VDOT conduct an analysis of whether or not the connectivity index did or did not improve connectivity before proposing to eliminate this element of the SSAR? Honestly, the answer is we conducted a lot of, you can call it study, before we implemented it, and it seemed like it would help. But with the slow economy and the grandfather provisions in the regulation, we have actually not accepted any streets under the new regulations as they were passed. So the answer is, in practice, we don't actually know. It might, probably would, from our research, but we just don't know because we haven't had any streets come in under that regulation. Next question. For the traffic impact analysis regulations, rezoning, proposal submittal. There's a question about a specific language in it. However, no submission shall be required under this section if the rezoning proposal consists of no changes in allowable land use. And the question is, does this mean there are no submissions required for special or conditional use permits? No, that is not the case. Since special or conditional use permit needs legislative action by the body, then it's not an already allowable land use. What that does mean, that language in that section, is that if you have rezoning that's active, and let's say it has some proffers attached to it, and you come back for a rezoning on that keeps the same land uses but make changes to the proffers. Well, if the changes are there to the proffers, not to the actual stuff that's going to go on the ground in terms of the land uses, then that would be exempt. Next question. Let's see. No submissions shall be required if the rezoning proposal results in lower maximum daily trip generation, no increases in AM peak hour of adjacent street, PM peak hour, etc. What does the sentence mean? A submission is required for government uses even if the governmental uses are allowable land uses. When compared to the average retention land use allowed by right under the current zoning, excepting governmental uses such as schools and libraries. The accepting governmental uses in such as schools and libraries language is put in there because in many counties, under agricultural uses, you're allowed to have governmental institutions in there. And because we're comparing, in that case, allowable under current zoning versus allowable under proposed zoning, we didn't want people to be able to say, hey, the current zoning allows schools, that means we could be generating 10,000 trips over here, and we're just going to be adding 10,000 homes, so we're not actually changing that. We felt that was too big a hole in the regulations, so we had to plug it by basically saying that governmental uses, in terms of their zoning for current zoning, didn't count toward that maximum traffic that current zoning would do in your comparison of before and after. For rezoning submittals, the threshold is 5,000 vehicle trips per day. Is that for weekday, weekend, or both? It's for whichever is highest. Let's see. Those residential zones generate more than 400 daily trips on a state-controlled highway, and once the site trips are generated and distributed to the receiving highway, the proposal's vehicle trips on the highway exceed the daily traffic volume such highway carries. What about a commercial use? The current regulation on traffic impact analysis has what we call a low-volume standard.
You have a question?
Okay.
You're going really fast.
Yeah, I'm sorry, because some of these are really long. I'm trying to get to the point. All right, the question is, for the low-volume street standard, why isn't that also covering commercial uses on low-volume roads? And there's two reasons. One, in the current regulations, as they exist, commercial uses are not covered. So we don't want to expand it to cover other things that were not already covered. That's number one. And number two, generally speaking, if you have a very low-volume road and you're building a business, chances are your business is not expecting to have a whole lot of traffic, since most businesses actually depend on the traffic that's already coming by the road, capturing the traffic and things like that. The problem area that we generally have with these sort of facilities is residential development. In other words, you put in a large subdivision off of the gravel road, and that's what that particular element of the regulation is designed to catch. Did that cover the question better? Okay. All right. There's a question on whether we have a list of locally approved ordinances or policies regarding traffic impact analysis requirements. And the answer is no, we don't, because A, these regulations have not gone into effect, and B, no localities have asked us to certify the requirements, because of course that doesn't exist in regulations right now. For less than 100, okay, for the table of requirements on traffic impact studies, there was a column for less than 100 site-generated trips. We've deleted that column. The column next to it should say for less than 500 trips. We may have deleted that language. We will fix that as we move through. It's the same question. Unless otherwise approved by VDOT, the pass-by rates utilized shall be those reported in Trip Generation Handbook, 2nd edition. That's the proposed language in the regulation. The question is, will VDOT allow any of the rates in the ITE Trip Generation Handbook to be used even if there's only one study for that land use? And honestly, while we would like to say no, the answer is if that's the data that's available, then that's the data that's available. Next question. Level of service analysis for highways shall utilize the techniques described in the Highway Capacity Manual, and preparers shall consult with VDOT on which traffic analysis software package is to be used to conduct the loss calculations. The question is, it references Highway Capacity Manual 2010. Older versions of the software will not necessarily utilize the techniques from HCM 2010, since some of these have changed significantly. Does VDOT have a time frame for when all offices will have Synchro 8 and HCS 2010 software? Answer, don't know yet. We're going to have to work with the other divisions involved to get that word out, to get those new software packages installed and in place, and everyone trains. This makes me think this is somebody from VDOT. All right. What default peak hour factor is to be used for existing condition analysis if the PHF calculated from traffic counts is lower than 0.85? That's regarding a change that we made in the regulation that basically says that if you have a peak hour factor lower than 0.85, you shouldn't use it. You should use 0.85. That's really a conditional item in that if it's just one count and it's 0.85, or it's below 0.85, then probably it could be, it could be a situation where the camera wasn't operating correctly, or you had some strange and peculiar surge in traffic that was not normal. If you have multiple counts that show the same thing, then yes, go ahead and use the actual calculated figure. But if you're just talking about one count, you have that number, move it toward the median, because chances are it may have been a fluke. Listing of documents accorded by reference, lists the manual on uniform traffic control devices. is this reference assumed to include the Virginia supplement? The answer is yes, and we can go ahead and add that if that clarifies things for people. We have more. All right, anyone else here? Any comments, questions? Yes, come on up. Once again, we're online, so if you say things from back there, it's going to be kind of hard for to understand. If you could identify yourself, that'd be great. Sure.
My name is Steve Schmidt with Bowman Consulting. I guess our question is, with traffic studies that are geared towards peak hours, and that's what we're studying, the level of service, queuing, that kind of thing, why the daily trip threshold as far as the change in the thresholds for needing a study or not?
The reason we went with the daily threshold actually is just has to do with simplification. If you're doing peak hour type based studies, depending on what your traffic generator is, you might have to run several different runs to figure out whether you're covered by the regulation at all and would have to do a study. Daily it's a little bit easier because there's generally fewer runs that you'd have to do in order to figure out whether you're covered. I'm trying to simplify things as much as possible. All right, any other questions? I'll go to the next one from the internet. All right, failure to connect. How will this be tracked and followed by VDOT? Okay, this has to do with the secondary street acceptance requirements. Right now, the current language is that if a locality has a failure to connect to an existing stub out for the new street, their secondary street funds are impacted in that the first priority in their secondary construction budget becomes making that connection. Under the proposal, the impact is to their revenue sharing program, and the impact can last for 3 years. Question is, how do we track that? How do we know that it's happened? And number one, when the paper comes in to accept the street into the system, analysis has to be done whether it meets all the connectivity requirements. If it does not, when it gets entered into DAX, there's a date put on it in terms of when that acceptance is valid. 3 years from that date is how long that penalty will run. And what will happen is Maintenance Division, which runs DAX, will supply us with information on when these things come in, they're not meeting connectivity, and then we will keep track of that in our division in transportation planning. Uh-oh. One more?
No more questions.
No more questions?
No more questions.
All right, I've been lax and I've let the computer do things it's not supposed to do. And let's see if that works. Yay, we're back online. Got one more question? All right, does anyone else here have any questions or comments? All right, do we have to do traveling music now? I'm just going to keep things going. While we're waiting for the last question to get printed, oh, yes.
Just,
Hey, Tom, can you come up here? Once again, we're online. Identify yourself.
Tom Flynn with the City of Richmond City Transportation Engineer. Can you just comment on some of the methodology comments? I see there's some items there, anything of significance there, or pretty basic stuff?
In terms of the changes on methodology, what we try to do is move closer toward current practice. For instance, for pacifier rates, instead of having that long list of VDOT specified rates, we just went to what's an ITE strip generation handbook, not the rate book. That simplified things a little bit. We also made some tweaks in areas where we had some language that was a little confusing and things like that for the most part. Questions? All right. And the final question for today, if 5,000 trips constitute significant impact, why would you go from 2,500 to 5,000 before a TIA is required? Seems to me that VDOT would want to be ahead of the game planning for trips. The reason 5,000 is being used, look, the definition of what's substantial or substantive or excessive or whatever, there is no hard and fast rule of that. We have to pick a number. Okay? The reason we have a low volume warrant is because when you've got a gravel road that's 16 foot wide, 400 cars a day is a substantial impact to that facility. If it's a 4-lane highway, like 460 or 29 or something like that, 400 cars a day is a drop in the bucket. That wouldn't be a substantial impact. So we have to find some threshold. 5,000 is an even round number. That's it. I mean, it doesn't go any deeper than that. Another one?
Not a chapter 8.
Okay. Should we stay online in case we receive more questions? No, I think it's okay to go. And with that, I'm going to go ahead and move this along. Let's see. Next slide. I'll go ahead and go to that one. All right. I've lost track of which one's which. There we go. I got the right one. There we go. All right, the next steps. Policy Advisory Committee will be meeting October 6th to go over the input that was received here, as well as discussing some of the other issues that have been brought up. The proposed regulations are going to be posted on our website as they get changed. They're on there right now. They will be updated as we move along. The Commissioner is scheduled to approve them next for the access management and traffic impact analysis. Again, the CTB will look at them October 19th, and they will become effective January 1st, 2012. Once that happens, and actually once the CTB approves their elements, we're going to start on preparing training materials, getting training material out to the public, VDOT staff, we'll be going out to the districts, and updating all our documents. And that is it. Thank you very much for coming. For those of you in the internet world, thank you for attending, and I hope all of you have a wonderful day. Oh, and we will post a video of this meeting on our website, hopefully sometime next week. Thank you.